Data is a people challenge, building trust, enabling governance, and growing leaders at BCI. So please welcome Jennifer Hartfield, Senior Vice President, Corporate Data and Operation on BCI. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining me today on the strategy track. As mentioned, I'm Jennifer Hartfield. I lead the corporate data and operations function at BCI. So my story with the data and analytics team begins in November of 2022, and I think some of you might recognize that date as when ChatGPT was released to the public. So I got the data team, and there was some very, very high expectations for where the data and analytics team was going to go. But actually, the story for me started about 14 months before that. And there was a dashboard that our data and analytics team was scoping for one of our private markets teams. And by all accounts and standards, it was a pretty straightforward dashboard. It was about their returns. We had the data, we had the technology, and when I took the team 14 months later, the dashboard was still not in production. In fact, it wasn't even really close. And it really was sort of a turning point for us to think about what is our data and analytics delivery model, and how can we avoid sort of similar situations in the future? And to be honest, how do we rebuild credibility with the business after sort of failures like this from a delivery perspective? So I'll just sort of back up a second for those of you who don't know BCI. We manage about $300 billion in gross assets for BC's public sector pension funds and insurance funds. We have public equity, private equity, fixed income, infrastructure, renewable resources, along with real estate mortgages and real estate debt and equity, which is managed out of our platform company, Quadrille. We don't, unlike some of the peers here today, have sort of a pensioner sort of client arm. We're purely the asset manager. So our job is just getting returns for our pension clients, generally trying to get about 6% for them every year. So when I took the team from back in November, we did a maturity assessment model, so a light, I would say, DCAM assessment, and sort of marked ourselves at about a 2.4 compared to what PwC was telling us our peers were at, which was about a 3.6. So we were really behind on sort of all dimensions of the DCAM framework, and I think that was really sort of a symptom of the fact that a couple of things. So our data and analytics team, they knew our finance department very well. I think they spent probably 60 or 70% of their time supporting our finance department. They did a lot of BAU. They supported a lot of legacy technology. But what they didn't actually know was sort of our investment management business, so what actually moves the dial for us and what our purpose is for. And I would also say that that all of the sort of other lines of business outside of finance were operating outside of our sort of central data and analytics platform. So everyone was effectively doing their own thing from a data and analytics perspective, and that really was, I think, what most highly influenced that sort of maturity score that you can see there. But I think when I looked at it, we had some really smart people on the team. We had good enough technology. We didn't have the best technology, but we had good enough technology. But what we really didn't have was credibility with the lines of business that we were intended to serve. And so really what it was for us was it was a people problem. And I think we heard it this morning, it was a change management problem. More than it was that we couldn't actually deliver, it was that we needed to get people to buy into what it was that the data and analytics team could do for them. So there was sort of a three-pronged approach to how we looked at changing that sort of narrative. So the first was around structure. So we really needed to think about how do we take data and analytics expertise that are currently sort of operating in this central model and embed them out into the lines of business where the decisions are happening and where they actually needed to add some value. Second, how do we build that trust or rebuild that trust that we could actually deliver? And thirdly, how could we be flexible enough? So, I think there's a lot of banks in the room, and maybe they're bigger than we are. We're about 800 people. And one of the things BCI actually prides itself on is being quite entrepreneurial. And so, in that entrepreneurial spirit, each of our lines of business or each of our asset classes actually has quite a bit of autonomy around what they want to do and how they want to do it. And so data and analytics needed to have this sort of flexibility to fit with this entrepreneurial spirit of some of our asset classes. And so where we landed was on this pod model. AI generated this image for me, but I think it does a pretty good job of trying to represent how we're structured. And I would expect that this is not an unfamiliar model to many of you in the room. But rather than having a central team, sort of a pool of resources that we tried to prioritize across corporate projects as they came down the pipe, instead we said we're going to take small groups of people and we're going to dedicate them to particular lines of business. Now, they all report centrally into a senior director of data and analytics. So they're centrally controlled and budgeted resources, but we do allocate sort of 3 people to one department, 4 people to another, and so that allocation of prioritization is actually happening at the resource level rather than the project level. And then there's this enterprise and governance function. So obviously, as the name would suggest, there is a pod that's responsible for data governance and also sort of enterprise data assets where it's not necessarily clear which line of business would own that data product. And then underneath, you can see there's a platforms pod. So we had originally a little bit bigger, but we've managed to sort of rationalize our tech stack down to have sort of 3 to 4 people supporting our data technology stack. So that all works together as a single data and analytics team, really broken out into different pods. And that shows 4 pods there. We actually now have 7 line of business pods that are serving different areas. And so maybe I would just highlight a couple of things about the model. So obviously, I talked about the dedicated capacity, but each department, so each line of business or asset class that we serve, they own the priorities for their pod. And what that looks like is, in the best of the model, because it's not all perfect, but in the best of the model, we would have someone from a line of business, let's say our private equity team, who every 2 weeks is grooming the backlog for the data and analytics pod, and actually setting the priorities of what they're going to work on, which also means that they can pause things that they don't feel are a priority right now. They can insert new things as they come up. And so what they find is that the pod is incredibly responsive to what they as a department need to do with data and analytics at any given time based on their business priorities. And of course, we have this sort of shared platforms and standards, which I already talked about. I think, I heard it earlier, I think from the gentleman at National Bank, about that central prioritization. And, for me, as a leader of this function, I never have to negotiate between executives on which project gets priority because we've already done that at the pod and resourcing level. And so it takes a huge load off the data and analytics team and the resources within to try and manage across different competing priorities. I think for those of you that work in investment management, you'll know that your head of sort of capital markets is never going to say to your head of private equity, no, you go first with your data priorities, right? Everyone is sort of driving to their own returns. And so when that prioritization falls to the back office, it can be very, very sort of difficult to hit the mark. And so we feel like we really love this model because it's kind of solved that prioritization challenge for us. And then some of the conversations that might happen at the executive level every year would be, where do we want to sort of, index more on data for a particular asset class? Or is there a case to add headcount for our private equity pod versus our capital markets pod. And so, those are the kind of conversations we're having instead of horse trading on particular projects. How many people in this room have their data and analytics team actually sort of set up in a similar model? Yeah, amazing. So I've heard Gartner refer to this model as sort of a franchise model, and I'm not sure that I totally agree with that as a description of how we've implemented it. I think of a franchise as you walk into a Subway, you know what the menu is going to be, you know what the bread is going to taste like, you probably know what the tile on the floor is going to look like. It gets quite formulaic. And just back to that point about an entrepreneurial spirit, our pods all look quite different. So, maybe to continue that metaphor, I'd say, we've got some pods that are going to the grocery store and the cookware store and buying the things they need to make a meal. And we've got some that are doing takeout, and we've got some that have sort of fine dining. And we offer sort of all of those experiences based on where any given department actually needs data and analytics sort of skills. So, one example would be our quant team, right? What do they need? Well, they've got billions of rows of data and very technical analysts, probably more technical than some of the analysts on the data and analytics team. But they need data engineering support, and they need their models to go from taking 10 hours to run to taking 10 minutes to run. And so we resource for them very sort of technical data engineering expertise, and we help them think about platforms, and they're really sort of driving the platform side of the whole corporate sort of ecosystem for us. And then we could have got Department B, which is, I would say, our most typical department, where we're saying, look, we'll do the data pipelines for you, we'll do the data quality, we'll do the modeling for you, but you've got smart subject matter expertise who know your domain, they're reasonably technical, they're wizards in Excel, they can build a dashboard, and so we basically serve you up well-modeled data, and you can do with it what you like. And we've certainly, as a team, embraced that Excel is a perfectly reasonable front end for data that we serve up. We encourage sort of live connections to our data platform. And then the third, which is a little more rare, but we do have a couple of examples of departments who really, like our legal department, they're not particularly technical. They want us to do sort of full end-to-end delivery, and so we do it all for them, including sort of dashboards and now more and more sort of AI-enabled solutions for them. And I think what we're seeing, obviously, as I'm sure many of you are, is that the self-serve aspect is becoming more and more realistic as people can vibe code, or we're working on connecting Claude via MCP to our data platform. And so we're really seeing the self-serve piece of it is really ramping up. And so I think more departments are going to sort of move down that sort of value chain to be kind of a department B and Department A, and we're going to do less and less, obviously, sort of end-to-end solution delivery. So, what did that look like rolling out that pod model? We had one private markets team that really, I don't know how else to describe it, but they've just sort of given up on the central data and analytics team. They had tried to be good corporate citizens. We had built some data products for them. And I think they found that the team didn't know their data, couldn't add value to the data quality side, wasn't overly responsive. They didn't have enough control to be able to make changes to some of their data sets when they wanted to. And so, they had put some data products into the corporate data platform and then gone off and sort of done everything that they wanted to do in Excel. And so there was this work to sort of rebuild the trust with them, which I'll maybe talk about here. So obviously the first part was foundations. They had data products in our data platform. We needed to rebuild those. The dedicated capacity that we had provided to them actually started to learn that data. They could actually add value in the modeling. And we were doing that. Now this was kind of the spring of 2023. I mean, it was mostly Power BI dashboards that we were doing. But that was not a bad place to build foundations, because the way that we needed to model the data to support those dashboards meant that we were modeling the data in a way that the private equity team could actually reuse that for many purposes. And we really had to get that data quality to the point that private equity started to trust that. And that looked like sitting with their existing data analysts, because they had data analysts in their team, and just sort of working side by side and then looking at where our engineers could take some of the load off, right? Some of that data quality work that they were doing in Excel, all the data gathering that they were doing through Excel, this sort of breaking this currency that we had in the organization of just sort of sending data around in spreadsheets. And so it was sort of the data engineer's role to go in, work with that data analyst, and just figure out how they could kind of take a load off that data analyst in private equity so that private equity resource could actually do more of the value-add analytics, and we were doing some of the heavier lifting behind the scenes. And then once those foundations were built, and that took a while, and it wasn't a great story to tell, right? We're like rebuilding stuff that they already could do, but we're rebuilding it more efficiently. So that took a lot of sort of leadership cover to get us to the point that we said, no, wait, like this is about data foundations, but we'll get you there, that then your velocity can really increase on how quickly we can deliver solutions for you. And then it came, right? So we had those foundations in place, and then all of a sudden we started to see that, like, kind of all this payoff at once, where the private equity team trusted us. The engineers that were dedicated to private equity knew the data and they could add value. They were better at actually estimating how long things were going to take them. That was something so we had to work through at the beginning, as we weren't great at estimating our own work. And we just started to really crank it out. And of course, our private equity team was brilliant in that our venture and growth team really wanted to push the boundaries on what we could do with analytics, and particularly with AI. So we really had that great pull from the business that they had a huge backlog of use cases that they wanted to move through, and we were able to start to really see that kind of flywheel effect of the more work that we had done with their data, the more and more we could produce for them. And for those of you in the asset management space, I mean, we kind of, as a back office data and analytics team, feel like we've kind of arrived with this latest phase, which is, in a consultative way, we've been asked to engage with some of our portfolio companies. So actually going out and working with portfolio companies on solving data and analytics challenges for them, and also working with the sort of investment and deal team. So a lot of the original work happened with our portfolio administration and monitoring functions, and now it's actually the deal teams and the value creation team that's engaging with exactly those same people in data and analytics from the data and analytics pod, but they've just finally have that sort of trust and credibility as a team that can absolutely deliver. So that's been a huge success story for us. So of course, the big sort of risk with this sort of model is, well, what about data silos? And I think echoing some of the things that have been said earlier, it's a sort of people, process, technology triangle of addressing that risk of data silos. So first, we obviously have a centralized enterprise data platform, the way that we name things, the way that our platform team ingests data. We really have very good visibility into the data that's in the platform, and so we can look for connections across data sources and make sure that we're not actually duplicating data in the platform. And the other thing that we do is we've really tried to build governance in, and this is probably standard, but it was new for us that when we ingest new data into our data platform, it has to become a defined data scope. It goes in our data catalog. We assign a data owner. We find a data steward. Like, we do all of that data governance work so that we actually have really good visibility into what is in the platform. And then I think there's sort of a people piece as well, in that our management, like we have a manager essentially for each of the pods, and they are a very sort of well-connected group. We do a lot of cross-pod demos so that people understand what other pods are working on, how they can maybe leverage both the data and or the sort of technical solutions that other pods are coming up with. And we also really try to do sort of very thoughtful rotations of resources through the pods. If you had worked in our private equity pod, maybe you move into our infrastructure and renewable resources pod, and there's some knowledge transfer that happens between, and also kind of looking for synergies in data that they've worked with before and how we can bring that together in new ways. We learned a lot of lessons through this journey. I think one of the things that I would share is that we originally thought that for every pod, or maybe every 2 pods, we would have a dedicated data product manager. We felt like we were really going to need that resource to translate between the business and the data engineers. And particularly being based in Victoria, we don't have a lot of people who have worked in the investment management industry that we're able to hire. And so we're bringing people from other industry and hoping that they have the aptitude to learn investment management. So we started out really kind of over-indexing on product managers. And what we found was maybe two things. At the beginning, it was helpful. Our data product managers actually could bridge that gap, especially when our engineers were new and they couldn't really talk to the business. They didn't understand that data. But eventually, over time, what we found is that our data engineers and the business started to find that data product manager was a sort of unnecessary intermediary. And so we found that it was actually more of a roadblock in some cases than it was adding value. So this model doesn't make it clear. We definitely still have data product managers. We use them on sort of bigger projects that the data and analytics team is doing. We use them in certain scenarios. We definitely use them in that enterprise pod where we're trying to build enterprise products that serve maybe 5 or 6 groups. But in our day-to-day interactions with the asset classes, we're really just trying to develop that skill in our data engineers that they can understand and relate to the business and that they don't actually have sort of an intermediary in between. And that's working quite well in most cases. In terms of success, we've reassessed ourselves on the DCAM framework at a 3.9, so take that with a grain of salt, but we really have seen a significant sort of maturity. I think that number of projects that we've delivered really speaks to the fact that there's no more projects that last 14 plus months and never get delivered. We actually take requirements from the business, we plow through it, they prioritize what they want us to work on, and so it means things get delivered, and we don't sort of deliver 100 things at once. We deliver 1 or 2 things at a time for any given line of business. But the big thing, I think, for us that was a really significant win is those 6 staff transfers. I think what I had described is that every line of business had sort of built their own data capability because they weren't being served by the central function, and we've had a number of those lines of business say, please take our data and analytics people, put them in the central team. You guys can provide better key person sort of risk management. You're providing better standards. You're providing better tooling. And we want you to manage those people for us rather than kind of managing those people within our own business. And so that's sort of a real validation that it's working for them. And why is that? Because we guarantee that we'll protect that capacity for them. Might not be the same people, but if they give us 2 people, they will continue to have 2 resources who are dedicated to doing their work. So that is it. I've just sort of pulled out the 4 takeaways that I think are most important from our journey, but we've got about 5 minutes left if anyone has any questions for me. Oh. Am I supposed to point people out? There's someone there, Claudia's there.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Alexandre. Just by looking at the business and data engineer transfer,
Yeah.
what's the relationship and where do the good old data analyst fits in there?
Yeah, where do the data analysts? I would say we call our data engineers, we're calling them sort of full stack data engineers. So originally we had this concept of like we had a data engineer, we had a business intelligence engineer, we had this data product manager, and now we've basically said everyone on the data team is a full stack engineer, which can mean a lot of things. Yeah. But I would say we would still say that the data analyst, like if I look around the organization, I'd say the majority of what I would call a data analyst, that role still sits in the line of business, and it's more engineering work. But there's definitely a very blurry line, especially in this kind of very flexible model of what we actually offer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's it, because the data engineer is pretty techie role, and the business knows the context, so sometimes there's a gap.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how that gap is fulfilled? I guess is both of them needs to level to the middle or something?
They level to the middle a little bit, I think. Like I said, we kind of had that data product manager role to fill that gap in some cases while the data engineers learned it. And I'm using data engineer pretty loosely. Like we've just kind of taken that term to mean someone who can, maybe build a pipeline, maybe build a dashboard, maybe build, an AI agent. They kind of have to do it all. We expect people to be quite versatile on our team. We're not a huge team.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah.
I have a question on the human side of your transformation.
Yeah.
What were the challenges that that your team faced to adapt that transformation? How do you teach your people to work in a different way, to utilize the new technology, etc.?
Sorry, I'm clicking through someone else's slides. There. Yeah, I think, again, that we really set a mantra for the teams, for the individuals who worked in the pods themselves to say, it is not just your job to sort of take direction on these main, sort of priorities that your department gives you. You are an ambassador for data and analytics to the department you serve. That means answering questions, it means helping people with their spreadsheet, it means being a point of contact if anyone has any data-related questions. Like, you have to do it all, and you have to be this ambassador for the program. And the other thing I think we really emphasized on the people side was not being territorial. So we felt like it's not a zero-sum game. If we've got some people out in the business that we're enabling that are very, good at data and analytics. We said to sort of our team, enable that. Like, don't worry about your territory. There'll always be enough work for you. Make sure that if people want to do it themselves, you support that. That's part of your job as much as it is to build the dashboard for the manager who wants the dashboard. So, that was a bit of a long-winded way of saying, like, we just really encouraged our own team to try to add value in any way they could. And I think that brought the lines of business on side to say, oh, this person can help me. Because that's all really anyone wants, right? They want someone to help them with their data. And so we really tried to sort of instill that mindset.
Go over so she can see. Sure. I'm Shang, and I'm an account manager, and I work very much in the business strategy of things. But I work also with data scientists and a team of analytics. And the business case that you mentioned about the people problem spoke to me because there is that isolated analytics team who work in a silo. And this forced me to think, would the people problem, probably similar to the question earlier, is it because we lack a scientific way of thinking? I came from a very scientific, intuitive background and went to business. And I thought the quantitative part of business is the qualitative part. And that seems to be the gap where strategy isn't always quantifiable. And so do you think it's the lack of corporate people, of just dedicated roles of being a strategist where we don't think like a scientist? And that's where we fail our data scientists and analytics team. I always feel this sense of embarrassment and shame that if I'm not able to translate the needs of an engineering team to business stakeholders. So I think that's one of the bigger discussions I think we need to talk about between the tech and the business people.
Yeah, I think what this model enabled, and it maybe doesn't answer your question directly, but what I think this model really enabled was to stay problem-focused, right? And so because the departments were setting their priorities, it always felt like the more technical teams could come with a real solution. I heard it earlier, like we weren't a solution looking for a problem. Everything was very problem and solution. It was a problem-solution match between the business and the technical team. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think yours was a little more philosophical, but that's how I was thinking about it. I think I'm getting the hook. So really, thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to chatting with some of you at lunch.
All right.